All right, so it's good that you now understand the difference between fractions and decimals and also how they're related to each other. But now it's time to apply that knowledge when you have a problem like this. So I have 64 hundredths, and I'm going to compare that to 34 hundredths. So 64 hundredths compared to 34 hundredths, but they don't look the same. So here's what I suggest you do when you come across a problem like this, when you see a decimal and a fraction and you're like, I don't know what to do. They don't look the same. Just change one of them into the others. So if you prefer to work with decimals, then you would change 64 hundredths into a decimal. I know that that's going to be a 0 in the ones place, a 6 in the tenths place, and a 4 in the hundredths place. And then I can easily compare it to 34 hundredths by looking here and looking at my place value, seeing 6 is larger than 3. So 64 hundredths is larger than 34 hundredths. Now say you're happier working with fractions. So I have 64 hundredths, and I'm going to compare that to 34 hundredths. Well, I'm just going to write that as a fraction exactly how I said it. Then all I have to do is look at the top numbers and compare. 64 is bigger than 34 because they both have the same denominator. So it really just depends on you, whether or not you prefer working with decimals or fractions. So I'm going to go ahead and bring another number into the picture for us to practice with. So I have 2 hundredths compared to 2 tenths. All right, 2 hundredths compared to 2 tenths. So I'm going to make my life easy, and I'm going to change these to being written in the same form. So I'm going to make them both decimal form first. So this is 2 hundredths already as a decimal, compared to 2 tenths as a decimal. So now I can compare them as decimals. They both have a 0 in the ones place, but this has a 0 in the tenths place, and this one has a 2 in the tenths place. So I'm going to say that that's larger. And if I would prefer to work with this as a fraction, I can go ahead and do this as 2 hundredths compared to 2 tenths, but I have to be aware here. These are not the same denominator, okay? So I can't just compare those 2's and 2's and say, oh, they're equal. I can't do that. I'm going to have to make them have the same denominator. So in this case, it might not be easier to go ahead and decide to use fractions because you won't have the same denominator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make them have the same denominator. I'm going to use hundredths so that I can just multiply. And I'm going to get 20 hundredths. So now they're the same denominator. I have 2 100ths compared to 20 hundredths. That's going to show me that 20 hundredths is larger, meaning 2 hundredths is less than 2 tenths. All right? So let's go ahead and do some more practice on that together. And then in the next video, we'll look at ordering these fractions and decimals when they are in mixed forms. So here is a problem for you. That is a 2. All right, so I have 27 hundredths compared to 2 7 tenths. Go ahead and figure out which one is greater. All right, so in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and start off by making them exactly the same. So either both a decimal or both a fraction. So I'm going to start off by making them both decimals. So 27 hundredths. Well, I know that that looks like this, and this one's already in decimal form. So I have a 0 in the ones place and a 2 in the ones place. Well, automatically, this one is going to be larger. Even though this one has more numbers on the decimal point side, this one has a 2 in the ones place, and this one just has a 0. So 27 hundredths is going to be less than 2 7 tenths. So say I wanted to work with this as a fraction. I have 27 hundredths, and I'm going to compare that to 2 7 tenths. Now, I don't actually have to make these equivalent fractions because I can see that there's no whole number here and there's a whole number here, making it very obvious that 2 7/10 is going to be greater than 27 hundredths. But if I want to be sure, what I would do here is I would multiply and turn this into 2 70 hundredths. Okay, so now I've got my whole number. Still, the whole number is going to win out, so in that case, it didn't make too much of a difference. But I can see here that 2 7/10 is going to be greater than 27 hundredths. All right, let's try one more. So let's go ahead and compare these two numbers. Oops. Okay, go ahead and compare this number to this number. All right, so I have 4 hundredths compared to 4 hundredths. Okay, well, that sounds like they're exactly the same. So let's go ahead and make them decimals, just to be sure. 4 hundredths, and this is the decimal is 4 hundredths. Looks like they're equal. If I wanted to turn them both into a fraction, they would again be the same. So in this case, they were just the same number, one in decimal form and one in fractions form. So please remember all of the things that you can do to make it easy to compare fractions and decimals. Make them the same. So make them all fractions or make them all decimals. And if you do use fractions, make sure that you pay attention to denominators. Okay? You have to make sure they have the same denominator to make it easy to compare.